But we can go ahead and get started for everybody, and we'll work on getting those slides pulled up in just a second. But I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Lauren Ward, and I'm an attorney with a business law firm here in Spartanburg, South Carolina, where we focus on estate planning and obviously business law. And then on here with me is Peyton, and he's going to introduce himself as well, and then we'll get started with the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. My name is Peyton Hoppus. I work out of the Spartanburg area, although I have a little bit of interest in Greenville as well, so I'm back and forth. But I work for a company called Parallel Financial. We're an independent wealth advisory firm. We focus a lot on business owners and clientele that need high touch and level of service. So I'm glad to be here. Hope to just bring a little light to some of the things that in the financial realm maybe you should be aware of, or just kind of how that goes. So I know Lauren's going to tackle a good bit of the estate planning. I'll tackle how that works for your dollars and what that looks like kind of combined. So I'm glad to get started.
Well, so today our topic is just 5 questions for estate planning. We're just going to be a quick overview of those. This isn't going to be a super in-depth kind of high-level webinar, so we can tell you a little bit about answering some of the questions we get the most in our industries dealing with estate planning. And Peyton, I didn't get the slides, so I'm going to let you take over and show the slides for us. So okay. Let me do that real quick.
Yep. Let me hit this button here and we'll be good to go. Hold on one second. Okay, here we go. Great. Well, my screen wants to work with me. Here it is. Perfect. All right. Everybody see us here? Good deal. Good deal. Okay. Well, there's the introduction. There's a little page there, but Lauren's going to get kicked off first. So I'll let her kind of jump in. These are some questions, just top 5, again, estate planning questions that we get separately, but want to jointly tackle. So Lauren, why don't you jump off and to kind of go through yours?
So with the questions I typically get, we kind of split this into 2 parts. So these are the differences I get a lot. So what happens if I die without a will? So a lot of people think, oh, I don't need to make a will. I don't need to do anything. I'll be fine. You know, my kids all get along, or those type things. Well, if you die without a will, technically in South Carolina, you still have a will. It's called the Uniform Probate Code, and it's under the laws of intestacy. And a lot of times what those laws of intestacy do are not what you actually want to accomplish. So for instance, if you're a married individual with children and you pass away, half of your assets go to your children and half go to your spouse. And a lot of times that's not what we want. As you know, married couple, you and your spouse probably want to make sure everything goes to each other first a lot of times, because these may be assets you've worked for together, you've built together, and those type things. So if you die without a will, you still have a will. It's called the Uniform Probate Code and the rules of intestacy. And if you don't have family members, it could eventually go back to the state of South Carolina. And that is something I don't think any of us want to happen. So having a basic will is always a good plan, just to make sure your family is covered. And it's not going under the probate code, but under who you want your assets to go to, and you get to pick your personal representative or the executor of your estate. So that's one of the biggest questions I get, is what happens without a will. And then a lot of times I get people wanting to know the difference between a will and a trust. So these are 2 different documents, but they are used together a lot of times. So a will controls what assets go through probate. So for example, if you have a life insurance policy and you've listed your daughter as the beneficiary, but your will says it goes to your daughter and your son, well, it doesn't matter what your will says. What matters is what's the beneficiary on that life insurance policy, as that is a contract between the parties. So life insurance is a contract. It's going to go by the beneficiary, and the will doesn't control because there's a beneficiary designation. So sometimes, you know, that leads to arguing if your beneficiaries don't match up with your will and your trust. So the will is just controlling what goes through probate. A lot of times we want to avoid probate. Maybe we don't want our real estate to go through probate. Maybe we just don't want it to go through probate because it's a year-long process or because it's public information. So that's when people think about doing a trust. And there's different types of trust, but what we're talking about now is just your basic revocable living trust. And this is just a contract really between the beneficiary, between the trustee, the grantor, and the beneficiaries of the trust. So it's you making the trust, and you're probably going to be the trustee, and it's just giving guidance on typically how you want those assets distributed after your death. And it's just like a contract we put in place, but it can hold real estate, it can hold investment accounts, it can hold bank accounts, it can pretty much do most of what you can as an individual. So the trust avoids probate, so it's a quicker process typically, and it's not public information like probate. So sometimes we do that because we want that probate avoidance. But we still usually have a will when we have a trust. And that will says if I forget to fund my trust, it's going to go into my trust at my death. And if you have minor children, the will is what we're going to use to name guardians of those minor children. So there is a difference. The will is only controlling probate assets. The trust controls whatever you put into the trust. And that's the conversation you want to have this based on an individual basis of what am I actually going to fund my trust with? And there's a lot of cool things we can do with trust. Like, for example, with blended families, we might use 2 different trusts and have different assets in each. Or we may have language in there that like at the first spouse death, all the property that, is property of the surviving spouse goes to their children, but property of the deceased spouse goes to their children. So there's cool things we can do to protect in blended families, or even to protect not even blended families. Maybe like you inherited some land from your great grandma and you don't want that to possibly go to your husband's next wife. So you want it locked up to go to your kids. We can do that. So a trust gives you a lot more options, a lot more control, and it avoids probate. But once again, a trust is more on an individualized basis. We want to talk about your plan and what works for you. So that's the difference between a trust and a will. And one of the biggest questions I get asked all the time is, how often do I need to update my estate plan? When do I need to do this? So the big times, anytime there is a big life event change, there's a death, there's a marriage, there's a divorce, there's children born. So those big events, whether happy or sad, that's when we're going to talk about updating your estate plan, because maybe you left your parents to be the executors of your estate, but they've predeceased you, so we need to change that. Or maybe you had your brother and sister-in-law as the guardians and they've got divorced, so we don't want to have that ex-brother-in-law in there kind of thing. We want to make sure we're keeping it how you want it. So those big life events, typically I'm going to tell you, even without those, you want to look at it around every 5 years to make sure it's still how you want it. That doesn't mean you need to update it. It just means let's take it out and look at it. We may need to update those powers of attorney. Maybe you did this when your kids were like 15 and now they're 30 years old and you're like, I'd rather them make decisions for me. So usually just looking at it every 5 years. If there is changes in tax law and those type things, that may be a good time to update it as well. Because right now our taxable exemption is very high. We have portability. You're looking at about $24 million before you have a taxable estate. But in 2026, that's coming back down. And it's going to be about 12 million, give or take, with inflation for a couple. So you may end up having a taxable estate, and we need to plan for that. But anytime this happens, you are going to see this on the news, on every channel. It doesn't matter what news station you watch. They are all going to be talking about these changes typically. I will say it is still good to check in with your attorney every 5 years just to make sure you didn't miss a change. Like, for example, the Secure Act went into place around Christmas of 2019. Well, then February of 2020, the world changed and we entered in a pandemic. So I think the 2019 Secure Act maybe didn't get as much attention and people didn't realize what it changed as much because there was something completely unexpected. So sometimes we miss those things. So it's still always a good time to check in with your attorney every 5 years or with those big changes in events. And so that kind of takes my portion of this, and I'm going to pass it over to Peyton, but I will be on here. So at the end, if y'all have questions, you can ask either one of us, but I will pass it to Peyton now.
Great. I got a question. I think it's just for general everybody to know, but I'll ask you at the end there, Lauren. We'll save that one. So, well, appreciate that. So with that being said, Lauren's got a lot of, and a lawyer in general, but Lauren being the head of that has got a lot of structuring, right, of your estate planning and how you structure your real estate, how you structure your retirement accounts, your bank. So I get a lot of questions around that. I usually have to defer to a lawyer because I can't give that advice by law. But what I can do is say, okay, well, we can have general conversations around some life insurance, retirement accounts, and banks. And so how do I leave my retirement accounts and bank accounts to my loved ones? This is a question I kind of had to form around some conversations I've had. And really it boils down to this. Lauren talked about having your life insurance as a beneficiary set up to, let's say, your spouse or to your kids. If you pick one, you can have multiple. Let's say we just pick one, and that's our kids. So if your will says one thing, but your beneficiary says another, you can have beneficiaries on your retirement accounts, on your investment accounts that are not retirement dollars. You can have that on your bank account. You can have joint owners. So there's a lot of ways to structure the beneficiary on an account. There's also a lot of ways, like, and a great example is a couple comes to me, a married couple says, hey, we have extra money. We funded everything we need to fund this year. And I'm working with them to go through what would make appropriate sense to fund. And they say, hey, we've got another 10 grand we want to invest, and we want to put that into a brokerage account. So a brokerage account would be investing those assets that are taxable if you buy and sell, but more so it's important how we structure the titling of that. So a lot of times people get kind of ahead of themselves and say, we want to invest, but our titling on it is not correct. So clients, prospects even come to me and say, this account's titled this way, but I have a trust. I'm saying, well, we've got a retirement account that looks good, but this brokerage account or this bank account is not titled for the trust. So technically it's not even involved in the trust. So we need to appropriately fix that. And the same thing with the couples who say we want to invest, but they have to make sure the titling's right. Because when one spouse passes, we want it to simultaneously, without going through probate, be in the other spouse's control. And we don't want to cause any really unnecessary movement of money or retitling of an account. So a joint account for a couple that wants to put money together, that's not a retirement account or a bank account, they're joint on a bank account, makes most sense. And then again, the beneficiaries on a retirement account, even beneficiaries on a bank accounts, those they have that option as well. Usually it comes down to either titling or beneficiaries is how we can leave money to our loved ones or to anyone. You can even leave it to an organization. Usually that's done through life insurance, but you can leave that money to someone by making sure that your title's correct and then your beneficiary is correct. And those go hand in hand. And again, like Lauren said, if you have a trust that has a lot of assets under it and an account's under that, we want to make sure that the titling is right for the trust, because the trust then dictates who the beneficiaries are. So we kind of go hand in hand in that regard. And so that's probably the main question I get of how do we structure all these accounts to make sure they go who we need to go to. So probably the fifth question here, but the second one I get is how do I use life insurance to help estate planning? So there's a couple of different ways. I actually just got off a call this morning working through this with someone who is going to retire in 7 years. There may be something we do earlier than that. And it was around life insurance and how do we structure it so that it maybe pays for estate taxes if there are any, because we're on the cusp of that, or if it pays for just maybe this individual passes away early and has got to leave it to his stay-at-home wife. So she's a homemaker. And so how do we take care of her? And so estate planning comes down to making sure, again, all the accounts are structured correctly, all the beneficiaries are structured correctly. But then also, what is life insurance? So there's annuities, there's term insurance, there's permanent insurance. They all play a role, but they all can be customized and structured in ways that you can use that to offset taxes. You can use that so your loved ones are, kept out of pulling money out of accounts. You can give them $1 million when you pass away, in an example, and they don't have to touch any of the accounts you've left them, right? So in this situation, if the husband gets hit by a bus, he's got life insurance, he gives the wife does not have to go pull from those accounts, even though they're structured right. There's no requirement on some of these accounts to be pulled. So if she needs money, let's not mess with those in taxes. The life insurance pays out tax-free. And so then now we have, let's say $1 million to use to live off of. We would invest it or structure it in a way that would make sense. So life insurance, it's very individualized and can be very, very customized. So you can customize it for a business owner. They get hit by a bus and the other business owners got to be able to offset some of those, maybe they were the driver of sales. They have to offset some of that to hire someone else. So life insurance and estate planning from an individual and a couple, even to the business owner, can be very useful. Again, it's tactful. It's not just a blanketed, everybody should have the same thing, but it can be used very much so to help to avoid taxes, to be quite honest with you, because we don't have to eat up into what we've saved up or invested. we have a large cash that's been paid out. Once the insurance pays that out, the insurance company pays that out, we can use that to help protect some of the assets or protect some of the investments and to get by and make the next leg of the trip of our life a little bit easier. So those are probably the main two. Again, accounts, how do we structure them? What does that look like? Life insurance, how do we protect what we've used? How does that come into play? And again, this is the financial side. So if we backed into, well, what do you want to leave people is more on Lauren's side, right? On the estate planning, trust documents, will side. And then as that's set up and we know what that looks like, then the rest of this kind of falls into place. But you need a financial advisor to help you sometimes get through all that, especially as you start building wealth. That's important to make sure that they are paired correctly. So with that being said, those are the two main questions I get on how we can do it. I know we probably have some people that have a question or two, and I've got one for Lauren because I think it's great just to talk through a little bit. But does anybody have any questions for myself or for Lauren?
Well, I was just going to add something to you said, Peyton, about life insurance. And one time people, I think, don't realize life insurance can be important is maybe you are not liquid really with your assets. Maybe you, as a family, we have clients who may not have a lot of cash or net worth, but they have a lot of real estate. And life insurance is a great thing so your family can keep that real estate and doesn't have to liquidate it if something happens to you. It's a way that they'll have money to pay like the taxes or the upkeep and those type things. Because a lot of times I have clients that have farms, family land, and real estate can you could have like $5 million worth of real estate, but then you pass away and you didn't leave your family any liquid assets. They can't pay the taxes or they can't pay the upkeep of the property. And life insurance is a good way to make sure there is some liquid for your family to have to help cover that real estate. So sometimes people don't realize it because they're like, oh, well, they're just getting some land. It doesn't matter. But land has expenses, and life insurance is a good way to have the liquid to cover it. So that's one time I think life insurance, and sometimes we want to think about we always think about using life insurance to cover our debts, but you need it in other times, even if you don't have debts, where you do have no liquid and your kids can't afford, and you don't want them to have to sell that family land. Maybe you want them to keep it for their grandchildren and those type things. So life insurance has a lot more purposes than just let me cover my debts.
Yeah, I've got a story on that recently. One of my best friend's family inherited 3,000 acres. So that's quite a large piece of land. And luckily there was a lot of liquidity there from just being in that situation of wealth. And it worked out, but they talked about having substantial amount of expenses that come through it. Luckily it's a tree farm and they have a hunting property on it. So there's revenue, but they're trying to take over what their grandfather essentially ran himself, which was his retirement business. He did that for fun, but it made money and get a good bit. And now they've got to take it over. And luckily that's going well, but they did talk about, okay, now going forward, our kids from their perspective, my best friend is, he's in his 30s, but the other side of his family, his cousins are like 18 and younger. So for them to have kind of this joint effort from the parent standpoint, it's like, we need life insurance to help protect, because your side of the family may have to have somebody sacrifice to go run it. But what about their side if they don't have it? So it played an important role, and we're working through that conversation now. And again, 3,000 acres in South Carolina is quite a bit to cover. But luckily there's enough liquidity there that they can get by, but it's been a big conversation. So I can't agree more with that. So with that, anybody got any questions?
What would be the right thing for as children go from being 17 and they go off to college? Now they're 21 years old, as far as powers of attorney that they should establish or medical documents, what as far as maybe giving the parents so that there's no there's no pushback if they get in a car accident, or what would be the general advice there?
So I would think they want to have, when children turn 18, they don't have a legal guardian anymore. So mom and dad aren't allowed to talk to the doctor. And we know a lot of times when children turn 18, they don't even want to call their doctor and make their appointments themselves. They want mom and dad to still do some of that. But if they were in a car wreck or something, they need to have that basic healthcare power of attorney that lists mom and dad or whoever as their agent. And the thing about it is revocable, changeable. So, when they are older, maybe they're married or have a significant other or whoever, they can update it at that point. So it doesn't mean that they're giving it to mom and dad forever. When their life changes, they update it. But they also probably want to have that financial power of attorney as well, because for one, schools can't talk to mom and dad even about tuition, which mom and dad may be paying, without the power of attorney. The only person they can talk to is the student. So you don't want to even have one that's like springing. You want one that is active now. So that way, if mom and dad need to call the registrar's office to say, hey, how much do we owe this year? They can get that bill paid. But two, if this child was in an accident and mom and dad needed to handle their banking, or child, has rent payments still due, those type things, mom and dad can handle that. So I think whether you're 18 or 100, that power of attorney for medical and power of attorney for financials is needed, because none of us are guaranteed a healthy tomorrow. But on top of that, when you just turn 18, sometimes you don't want to do everything and you want mom and dad to do it for you. And that's how you let them do it then as well. But I do think that's needed for everybody.
Right.
Any other questions?
I have one question. Is it correct that taxes don't have to be paid on insurance when it's collected by beneficiaries?
Yeah, you don't pay estate taxes or anything on life insurance unless you have a taxable estate, which is 24 million for a couple, about 12 million individual. But life insurance is tax-free to beneficiaries.
Yeah, and Sabrina, that goes for life insurance. Let's say it just pays out from work, or it pays out from because some people have policies through work, or they have their own individual policy. And let's say that's $1 million. So as far as the estate portion, for what Lauren's saying, there's a threshold there, but the average person may not get to that level. But let's say it's $1 million that pays out, and somebody's husband, passes, and then they get that's not, that life insurance that they're getting paid on is not taxable. There are some other life insurance policies that you could have qualified money into that could pay. You may get into something like that. But if we're just talking very simple life insurance payout, typically no. There is no income tax. And again, Lauren's talking about the estate tax. But if it's a husband or something, or even a mom that pays out a child in a life insurance policy, there is no taxes owed as far as income, ordinary income. Again, if it was some crazy $15 million policy and the estate tax kicks in, that might be a different CPA question, but simply no. Yeah, most of the average person is probably not going to run into that issue. Yeah. Anybody else?
What about if you've got a single parent, they've got a couple younger children, whatever, minors, right, regardless. And those children I don't believe can be listed as the primary beneficiaries. I think they can be listed as contingent, but I don't think they can be listed as, I should know this, but I don't think they can. So a lot of times, well, I say I've run into this a couple of times, so they'll name a sibling as their primary beneficiary. But what should be done in the event? Should there be a trust created for those children on how that money would be? What would be the
So, what I would do is think about, like creating a trust, and if they don't want the expenses of a full revocable living trust, they can set up a trust inside of their will, and they can list the beneficiary as the children's trust created under the will of John Doe situation. So it funnels into that children's trust. I probably would have a revocable living trust just to make it easier and avoid any part of the probate situation. But that would be an option, because you don't want to leave it to sibling, because here's the issue. So say it is like a good policy, like maybe it's $500,000 and you have 2 children. You leave it to your sibling. So sibling just got $500,000. They can only give, so say siblings married, so there's 32,000 give or take that they can actually give to children without tax consequences. And so that's 64,000 of that dollars a year they could give to children. And then if they want to invest this life insurance money and it makes money, that's aunt and uncle paying taxes on it. Aunt and uncle are having a whole lot of tax implications from this. Maybe it's not a big deal if it's just, you know, a little $15,000 policy that you have for your burial expenses. But if this is really to support your kids, setting up that revocable trust and making it the beneficiary protects those kids. And if they did, so if somehow they left their kids as primary, or they were contingent and ended up inheriting this life insurance and it's over $16,000, you have to get a conservatorship appointed with the probate court. And then that means you're checking in with the probate court every single year. You have to ask the probate court permission to spend this money, and they don't like to let you spend it, even for things like, they have denied it for things like braces, which are pretty things that people do need. But they're really particular on what you can spend this money for. So as a single parent, especially, you know, setting up that trust for those minor children could be one of the best things they could do for them in the long run if something were to happen, and making sure they have their guardians listed and their trustees listed. So for instance, if it went to conservatorship, the other parent would be the one that would probably be the conservator. And maybe you don't want that, because maybe you and other parent divorced because of other parent not being good at finances and those type things. And you don't, or maybe you just don't like your ex-spouse anymore, and you want to make sure it's your sister or your best friend in charge of the money. And you can do that with a trust, where you can't do that with just beneficiary designations.
Okay.
Steve, you may well know, but you can do a custodial account, and you can set those up ahead of time. We've had that happen where people, you know, later in life have set up accounts for grandchildren and said, Mom and Dad are going to manage the money. I'm going to leave it to them. And that's actually in my family right now. We went through that with my grandparents, and that was the solution, is setting up accounts that basically have nothing in them, but the will and the trust say it's going to pay out to that account, or it's going to be held in trust. And so there's a couple of different ways you can do that, just depending on, you know, what advisor you go through or what platform you're a part of. So that's something else to think about. You could not that circumvent the trust, but you can do accounts and have the wills and have the trust point in that direction and give control to, you know, a sibling, maybe your sibling, and it's over for your kids. And that way they have to do what's in best interest for your kids, and they get full discretion of when the money can come out. But that's another route you can take.
Okay, thank you.
Well, if nobody has any other questions, it has been a pleasure presenting to y'all today and having you as watch our seminar. If you have questions, here's both of our emails here. Also, you're welcome to call my office or just shoot me a quick email. Happy to answer any questions. But thank you all for joining us, and we're glad you took part of your day to spend with us.